but you need a tribunal of people looking at the particular facts of the problem to decide precisely how the concept should apply. And certainly in the United Kingdom, in human rights, for instance, the balance between liberty and state security, the balance between family life on the one hand and the interests of society on the other, the balance between the environment on the one hand and the legitimate interests of a developer. This balance is increasingly being struck in the courts, and I think struck in a way that society is finding satisfactory. So maybe in solving these problems, the courts have a more prominent role to play than you might have imagined. And the more so for this second and additional reason, which is that at a Supreme Court level anyway, you will find that the reasoning behind the decision, and there was a call for reasoned solutions, the reasoning behind the decision is expressed in a particularly persuasive way. I can only speak on this for the UK, although I believe it may apply in other countries throughout Europe and in the United States, that the ability of the courts to articulate the human rights rationale of decisions has contributed a great deal to the growing adoption of a human rights culture. And that might give us some hope for the future, because if the courts can be influential in that way in relation to human rights, then maybe they can be influential in relation to other issues of grave concern. I think, for instance, in relation to social issues such as the rights of Muslims and the wearing of headscarves and things of this kind, we badly need better and more rational decision-making by the courts, and I think that in relation to the environment, we need to strike similar balances. And so I think that the ability of the courts to adjudicate in these finely balanced cases and to strike a balance between different interests and to give reasons for their decisions which will influence the public at large. This is a very, very important aspect of governance going forward in the future. And that's why some of us, as I said, if you will allow me to conclude with a commercial, are promoting the idea of an international environmental court which would fulfill these objectives, which would enable this balance to be struck, which would, above all, enable reasoned decisions to be given. And if I come back to the point about confronting those who are not in favor of these solutions or who don't care about these solutions, it's not just public opinion, it's not just the dissemination of information, it's not just a free press, but it is the ability of the judicial system to stand up and explain why we as a society need to enforce appropriate legal constraints, which I think in the future is going to become very, very important. If you want to know a bit more about those ideas, please go to www.environmentcourt.com and you'll find out a bit more about it, or by all means email me later. And otherwise, I applaud the organizers. It's been a thrilling visit to Athens. My visit to a sun-bathed Parthenon yesterday will stay in my memory for a very long time. Thank you.
Well, it's been a great honor and great responsibility and great pleasure being here 3 days, literally standing on the shoulders of giants, being in the company of John Solston, John Harris, Peter Lackman, George Christie, Stephen Hockman, Nick Ashford, Inez, Linda Nielsen, who is not with us this evening, and so many others. And of course, I'd like to thank profoundly the Foundation for making this conference possible. Also, I'd like to thank somebody who has not been on this earth for the past 600 years. Thank you, William Shakespeare, because of the great John Harris' passion for you and Emilios, the two colleagues, the junior colleague and the famous colleague from the University of Manchester, met on a Virgin train one day and discussed non-stop William Shakespeare until they reached London Euston, and I think over the tube trip. And they continued for the next couple of years. And then they thought, let's do something together. And Leonidas was so keen, who is the third and the most important father of this idea and of this conference, was so encouraging and so instrumental in making this happen. But first question, what does an international financial law expert and financial law and economics experts is doing in such a conference? Well, let me start with the title of my summing up, and it's going to be a very difficult summing up.
Not too long.
I hope so too, John. So, can we green humanity? Is there a role for economic governance in greening humanity? And I have to admit that while we're playing with the title with John, and I was thinking how to green humanity as a title, John came up with the idea, greening humanity, and I thought, yes, that's much more drastic. So can we do it, and can we do it in the way that we set out to do it in this conference? So what does a Nobel laureate in science and myself are doing together in a conference like this? What a leading QC is doing here with leading economists? Why have they been put together? What's the aim? What's the objective? What, after all, do I have in common with Peter Lackman apart from an affinity for Cambridge? Well, much, much, much more. But first of all, let's see why. Let's recall to our minds one of the great thinkers of the 20th century in the field of technology and uses of technology. Professor Michael Dertouzos, who is also was the late Professor Michael Dertouzos from MIT, who was also one of the intellectual patrons of this foundation. This is what Dertouzos used to cite as a call to action, a poem called Unification. I cannot recite to you the whole poem, but let me just recite to you the last 4 or 5 verses. Argue from logic and emotion. Technology is humanity's child, as is our quest for human purpose. To love them is to love ourselves. There are no differences, only labels. Well, I wish that was true, but it's not, because since Aristotle, most of us have a specialization. So why so many disciplines? Let's think about it. Biology, and we have one of the foremost biologists of this world among us, explains our material essence and our natural environment. Philosophy pertains to help us to understand and advance both. Science helps us to exploit and advance both. Economics helps us to exploit both, allegedly in a cost-efficient way. Ethics and religion to preserve them. And law, at a minimum, helps us to protect human, natural, social, and economic life from the violent interference of state and non-state actors. even though such protection goes only as far as prescribed by the relevant rules. And the prescription given in the relevant rules is going to be the central idea of my summing up. Oops. Critical questions. Do all those disciplines do what they claim to do? Do they really stand for what they claim to stand? Which of the above is true? Which is false? If true, how does each discipline achieve its objectives in the wider sustainability and global governance context? Linda Nielsen said, through openness, transparency, a global and interscientific dialogue, enrolling also the young. But is it that simple? What if the claims that all those academic disciplines or sciences make are false? Peter Lackman explained to us the role of religion in cultural evolution as opposed to total dependence on genetic properties, and how important is cultural conditioning as opposed to genetics. Polemachakis explained the many limitations of economics and the failures of the markets. Now Varoufakis, even more provocatively, went much further and explained to us that economic theory, applied economic theory, more often than not, does not produce the distributional efficiency outcomes that it claims that it produces. And as a matter of fact, modern economics, there are areas where the neoliberal market-based approach often leads to more harm than good, including the failure to produce useful medicines or the recent global financial catastrophe. How about law? Why did we invite the lawyers? After all, they charge high fees. Why didn't we throw them overboard? Is it only an issue of good or bad drafting? Will the courts which the courts, good or bad drafting or rules which the courts will then come and enforce, as George Christie suggested? And I have a great respect for George Christie. If only law does just the above is for our purposes law irrelevant? Hardly. But let's move on, because I will return to that question. Has this conference achieved anything? Well, first of all, it achieved something from day one. John Scholsten's smashing speech explained to us the key role that universities have to play in order to foster sustainable practices, habits, and behavior among all of us. But have we learned anything else? After all, John Scholsten is a Nobel Prize. Did the rest of us, debating those issues for the next 2 days, waste everybody's time? No, we did not. We learned, as a matter of fact, an awful lot. Scholsten explained that there are areas of human activity that are not capable of commoditization, where in the same manner that there is no atmosphere in space, so there is no atmospheric failure, the areas of human activity and interaction of human activity with the natural habitat where there is no room for the market. But which are those areas? Well, then Varoufakis comes in and gives a first rough definition of which are those areas. The core, the substance of human existence, whether as a living being or what Father Pilophoros called personhood, a person capable to reason, and of course, the surroundings of the human species,